existed, and then the gods, who themselves are violent, battle and struggle to overcome chaos, which is normally seen as a female god. And humans, because of this chaos, which is always at the door, there is necessity for order to be imposed from on high. Men over women, masters over slaves, priests over laity, aristocrats over peasants, rulers over people. Obedience and order become religious values because the religion legitimates those social powers and legitimates this myth of redemptive violence. The god rules through the king. Because chaos is always at the door, empire requires ever more conquest to remove the threat and anxiety of chaos coming in, the barbarians beyond. And the victory is always won by means of violence. So the myth of violence is somehow redemptive, somehow violence actually will save us, ultimately, is the founding myth, Wink says, of empires and of domination systems. And the psychodynamics of that myth are played out in cartoons. We were having a conversation last night with, who is it, Rupert? Is it? Yeah. You're not called Rupert, are you? I don't know why I called you Rupert. Sorry? Ronald, that's right. Yeah, I had R in my mind. And Ronald had read a book that I'd read in which, a book called Colossians Remixed, in which the authors say that Disney reinforces that myth all the time. And we had a conversation, and I hope I maybe convinced you that it in fact does. And the way it reinforces the myth is that you have a good guy and a bad guy. And the bad guy typically wins through about 3/4 of the story. And that with the bad guy, we project our own violence within ourselves onto the bad guy. So we like all this mayhem and murder and chaos that the bad guy is creating. But ultimately, within us, we know there's also a good guy. And the good guy is beaten up to within an inch of his life. And he's nearly on the point of death. And then he somehow discovers strength. And what does he do? He uses violence to defeat the bad guy. And the winner isn't the good guy. The winner is violence. So the myth of redemptive violence is perpetuated through the thousands of hours that children watch TV or read comics or play computer games. It's there. And it's the founding myth of the domination system. It's necessary for that domination system to have its being. So the domination system actually controls our imaginations. It controls our thinking from an incredibly early age. We are, I don't know if you have the word in Holland, we are catechized. Just as the church catechizes Christians into the Christian faith, we are catechized, we are discipled, we are trained, we are taught into the domination system to accept this system as normal and normative. And the myth itself serves as the inner spirituality of the national security state. We watched a bit of West Wing this afternoon about the White House, and there in the depths of the White House is the Situation Room where they resort to violence, massive, awesome violence against their enemies, as and when necessary. There's just a thing about violence, which is important, that we shouldn't only see violence as kind of military violence or physical violence, but actually there are 3 kinds of violence. So we have So we have, we have physical violence. So the violence of warfare, of weaponry, of physical force. We have structural violence. So the violence of the trade rules that benefit the rich at the exclusion of the poor. The structural violence of the West refusing to deal with its climate change issues, which is a violent act against those people who are losing their livelihoods and potentially lives. And cultural violence, of which we are seeing a rise in Europe at the moment, typically France, where women are not being allowed to wear the burqa, you can play that out in all kinds of cultures. So when we're looking at violence and redemptive violence, we need to recognise that all of those violences are in play as part of the domination system to reinforce, to hold that. And we buy into it because it also buys our security. We are complicit in it. We go along with it because ultimately I'd prefer to live here than in Angola. I'd prefer to live here and be fed than to live in Somalia or whatever. So we go along with it. It's in our interests. We're complicit in it. The classic one, and it's the story that I know quite a lot about, is Israel blaming Hamas for violence, when actually Israel perpetuates huge structural violence on the Palestinians. And actually through the structure of the wall, which a lot of you here last night were kind of meditating on. And that's what that is up there. It's a wall. Okay, that's the domination system. How do we engage with it? What do we do with it? Well, the story that we're in, the story of Israel and Jesus. The story of Israel begins with a cry of people who are in a domination system, the domination system of Egypt, and they are at the bottom of the heap. And the pressure is being piled on them more and more. They now not only have to make bricks, they now have to go and get their own straw to make the bricks. And the cry comes to God. And this is the big, fat story of Israel. This is the story of liberation, the story of our faith. I heard a Jewish theologian on the radio once, and he said this: Jewish theology is really very, very simple. And it goes like this. They oppressed us, God delivered us. We win, let's eat. That's it, pretty much. And so that story of being born as a nation in oppression is a really interesting story. The Genesis story itself, as a founding myth, doesn't reinforce power domination story. It tells a very different story from the other creation myths that were written around about that time. And whether it was written coming out of Egypt or whether it was written coming out of Babylonian captivity, it is there to tell a story which is a subversive story. Genesis is subversive of the domination system. That's what it's written for. It tells a different story of our origins. It does not reinforce the status quo. The prophets through Israel's history start to see a time when nation will sit down with nation, when swords will be beaten into plowshares, when lions will lie down with lambs, and violence will be no more. The early disciples believed that that era had dawned with Jesus, that this era of peace had dawned. So therefore, Christians would not take up arms. If they were in the army, they had to resign a position which would involve them in killing. Some of the army was more like a police force, so that was okay. So Jesus totally undoes that domination system. He attacks it at every anchor point of its being. Hierarchy. The lords of the Gentiles exercise authority over them. It is not to be so amongst you. I am amongst you as one who serves. Hierarchy. Equity. Ched Myers says, how shall we understand the kingdom of God? So many of Jesus' parables are about economic relations. And he's got this great phrase, instead of calling it the kingdom of God, which really doesn't mean very much to us now, let's call it the capital G, capital E, great economy.